answer some of the questions along the way.
For sure. And then, is anyone else speaking, or are they just here for questions?
I think I'm the only speaker, and then, yeah, it's just questions after that.
Okay, perfect.
Hey guys, this is Brian Klinker from the FAA. I joined by way of the EPIC link. I didn't get a formal invitation, although I was on the email that suggested I would. So just FYI, I'm here listening in attentively.
Thanks, Brian. George, did the guys from the Airworthiness Office get invitations like they were supposed to? Larry Buckus and Brian Roth?
So everyone that Daryl sent over my way has been added. So.
We have David Sizu in as panelist, and
yeah, I don't see our Air Force Airworthiness guys on there.
All right.
Hey everyone that's joining us, thank you for coming to see us today on this Wednesday webinar. We're going to give a few minutes for attendees to get in, and then we'll get started with Frank, our Airworthiness lead.
I'm going to go ahead and get started, and then as people join in, they can add their thoughts. But welcome everyone to another Ask Agility Prime Anything. We've got myself here to kind of talk through some airworthiness. I'm going to run through my slides once again from the launch, so they'll look familiar if you were there for that. But the idea is to get everybody on the same page and then open up for questions that people might have about airworthiness and certification. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right, everybody should see the slides on the screen. So my intent here is to run through kind of a quick comparison with definitions of airworthiness between the civil side with the FAA and the Air Force with the DoD. And then I will run through some of the kind of the why and the what of airworthiness and Agility Prime specifically. And if you have questions, just send them in and we will hit those at the end. I'm not going to take too much time on this. But to start off, if you look at the comparison chart that we have here, you'll see that there are a lot of similarities between the FAA and the Air Force. In fact, the definition of airworthiness, while maybe the words aren't exactly the same, the intent is there. So you've got your design, which is evaluated against a set of criteria, and then you produce against that design. You operate and maintain that produced item against the original airworthiness design. As long as all those things come together, then you have a quote-unquote or airworthy vehicle. So it's all four aspects that have to be addressed, and you'll see that on both the civil and the Air Force side of things when it comes to the process owner. On the civil side, you've got the Aircraft Certification Service, the Compliance and Airworthiness Division over there. In the Air Force, we have a Technical Airworthiness Authority. So the airworthiness, the person responsible for airworthiness in the Air Force is the Air Force Material Command Commander, who is General Arnie Bunch. He's the 4-star here at Wright Pat. But he delegates the responsibility for creating and maintaining kind of that system of airworthiness down to a Technical Airworthiness Authority, and that's Mr. Tom Fisher, who's dual-headed as the lead of the engineering side of things over in the Lifecycle Management Center here at Wright Pat as well. So Mr. Fisher is pretty much the lead guy for all airworthiness in the Air Force. So if you hear me talk about the TAA, that's what I'm talking about, Mr. Fisher, right there, and that's one of the jobs that he holds. When it comes to the offices that kind of manage and control the airworthiness side of things, you've got the ACOs on the civil side, which if you've been working on a civil cert, you're well familiar with those guys, I'm sure. On the Air Force airworthiness side, we have our airworthiness office with the office symbol EZZ in the Lifecycle Management Center. So that's kind of your equivalent there. When you get to design standards, you've got 14 CFR and the various parts. I listed 23 to 39. Obviously, there are bits and pieces kind of strewn about 14 CFR as they apply, but that's where you find your design standards for the civil side. On the military side, we have what's called the Mil Handbook 516C, and each of those sections complies or goes against a kind of a subsection. So you'll have a structures part, you'll have an avionics part, or flight sciences. You have each of the parts that make sense. It's interesting enough that the 516C actually started its life as kind of a first flight checklist for first flights of new aircraft, and it's evolved into this handbook in the Air Force. And so that's where you find the military, and that's actually not just the Air Force. That's the 516C is a joint publication for all the services in the DoD. Our airworthiness approval. So on the civil side, you'll get your type certificate with your supplemental type certs for specific modifications that have been approved, and those require full compliance with those 14 CFR parts. And you work with your ACOs to show your methods of compliance for those certifications. On the military side, we have a military type cert, which is pretty much equivalent to a civilian or civil type cert, and then we have a military flight release, which is a little bit different. So one of the major differences that you see in the military or in the Air Force's airworthiness way of operating is that we don't necessarily require compliance with that Mil Handbook 516C to achieve an airworthiness approval. What we can do is we can look at what you've done, and then we can look at the difference or the delta between the standard and what you've provided as a method of compliance. And we can either say, okay, you didn't do the same thing that we would normally do, but it's equivalent, it's sufficient, and we go from there. Or we say, well, you've done 80% of it here. I get that you're not going to be able to do the other 20%, so that leaves us with some level of risk and hazard. And so we apply a risk analysis and a hazard analysis to that. And then that is passed on to the program management chain in the Lifecycle Management Center. So it's within kind of the same organization, but separately. Those are the guys that do the acquisition and then manage the lifetime of the vehicle, hence the name Lifecycle Management Center. And that program management chain with your program executive officers and all the way up to Dr. Roper are responsible for acquiring and then operating and maintaining and all the way to disposing of these systems. And so they maintain kind of a risk management strategy for that platform based on what falls out of the airworthiness side of things. So that's where we're a little bit different. We don't have full compliance as a requirement to get airworthiness approval. Our military flight releases are kind of a step down from a military type certificate. So our military type certificate is equivalent to a civilian type certificate in that it establishes airworthiness approval for a design, and then you build against that design, and then that specific tail number obviously gets your airworthiness certificate that you can see behind you when you walk on board any civilian airplane. Well, we do a similar kind of thing, but if we don't see the need to go to a full military type certification. So for instance, if we need to do a one-off flight for maintenance, if we have some kind of reason to limit what we're trying to do. So a lot of times we'll see that here in the lab. We're trying to do an experiment on an aircraft. It's very short term. It's limited in its test plan to scope. So you define the envelope that you can do it. You maybe define where you can do it. You define when you can do it and how you can do it. And you pare it all down into this very specific regime, and then you issue a military flight release against that. So that way we don't have to take a full 516C eval against anything other than what we're trying to find in that specific envelope. So it gives us a little leeway, a little freedom to do some things outside of what you might normally do with a military type certificate. But if you move on, you can see on the civil side, you've got your experimental ticket. Well, we don't have an equivalent to an experimental ticket. And so the MFR is not the equivalent to that, because the MFR is still looking at your design and it's still evaluating that design against a set of standards. Whereas an experimental ticket, there's kind of an initial look at what you're doing and defining where you can go and do the things you want to do, but there is no design approval inherent within an experimental ticket. And so that's the big difference between a military flight release on the DoD or Air Force side of things and the experimental ticket that you see in the FAA. And that's why you'll run into a lot of times when you take your experimental ticket to an Air Force or a DoD operator and say, look, I've got an experimental ticket, can I go do these things? And a lot of times those DoD operators will say, well, there's probably goodness in that experimental ticket, and I'm sure you've collected some artifacts that maybe could be used, but that in itself is not sufficient for us to issue an airworthiness approval on the DoD side of things. So if we move on to why we're here, so this is really why we're talking about airworthiness when it comes to Agility Prime. So why are we as the government here? Well, for the near term, what we want to do is we want to support industry's journey towards a civil certification. So if we can provide access to some DoD maybe facilities or resources, or even some technical expertise or in the Air Force or in the lab that maybe we can help you with, or if you're looking for an extra opinion on a design or something like that, we can help with that. And we can do that under Agility Prime, under our in-kind testing. We are also here to provide airworthiness approvals if needed for those collaborative flight tests. So if we end up doing some flight testing with you and maybe the range that you want to go to requires some kind of airworthiness review or approval, we can do that. If we end up getting to the point where the Air Force is paying for flight tests that we're interested in, obviously at that point we'll definitely need an airworthiness approval, and so we can help with that as well. In the long term, what we want to do is really kind of lay the groundwork for what it's going to take to get to an airworthiness certification from the Air Force. So that means getting smart on the systems that are out there, understanding some of the newer technologies that are coming with this that maybe the Air Force isn't as familiar with. And also we want to help to support that industrial base, because we recognize this, and that's the uniqueness of this program, is that this is not a traditional Air Force lays out the requirements with a set of specifications against a dedicated mission. This is actually the opposite of that. We're saying, look, there's a lot of traction out there in the market right now that's driving the mission, the quote unquote mission, which is really a civil mission in the urban air mobility or advanced air mobility kind of regime. And we're happy to let that happen. We don't feel the need to come in and dictate terms. And so let us help to make that happen, get that industrial base formed here in the United States and our allies that then we can leverage for future dual use capabilities that may come down the road. But at this point, we're really more flight following and providing support along that civil path. So what can you expect? As you've heard before, we have our areas of interest that are out there. They're on the webpage on agilityprime.com. You can download those and look at them anytime. You can see the 3 that we have out there right now. In each AOI, you will see phases. The first phase is really your submission to that AOI, which is a solution brief, and it really gives us some insight into what your design is, how you intend to address that design. You go through, there's really a list of questions in there that just kind of gets us all on the same page so we understand where you're coming from and how that might relate to what we can do to help. And then in phase 2, once we've gone through those solution briefs and you move on to phase 2, that's where we get direct company engagement. So that's where you start to see the conversations happen, and that's where you'll see that we engage with you to really kind of have a more in-depth understanding of your your design, and at the same time, you will get a more in-depth understanding of what we can do to help you. We'll have our Mill Handbook 516C SMEs, our system subject matter experts there to get an idea of what kind of risk levels might be there based on their knowledge of 516C, so that they can grease the skids and get everything ready for an airworthiness approval from the Air Force in the future as well. And then finally, phase 3 is where you get your request for prototype proposal. That's where we kind of establish some kind of, here's what we're going to do for each other, whether that's a CRADA for us to do some kind of ground testing with you, or even flight testing in a range somewhere that we can set up for you, or there might be an actual contractual kind of relationship beyond a cooperative research and development agreement that we can work with you to help, again, get to civil certification requirements and start building up that volume of information that you need to get there from here. Because we understand that civil cert is really key to starting to earn some revenue and earn profit, and that's what's going to drive that. In the long term, our airworthiness team is going to engage with the broader airworthiness community. So we're already meeting with NASA, FAA, and some of the other services on where their plans are, because we really don't want you as industry to feel like you're being pulled in different directions by different airworthiness authorities. There ought to be a lot of similarities between them. Obviously, there are differences. There are places where we have different kind of things, like you saw with our ability to add risk into our process. So that's just going to drive differences. But for the most part, we want there to be a lot of similarity there, simply because if something's good enough for the FAA and they show that there's sufficient evidence there to accept for compliance, we ought to be able to make the same kind of argument on our side. So we want to get smart on that. And then our guys are going to start working on building that roadmap so that when the time comes and we do need to engage the airworthiness process and the Air Force side of things, we already know how that's going to look and how we're going to do that. Whether that's based on the FAA's type cert and iterating off of that, or just flying directly under the FAA's type certification, or some kind of hybrid of that. We will work that out now, and the way we can do that is having those early engagements with industry now, so that we can understand those systems and we can understand what we need to know. But there are things about these systems that like the simplified vehicle operations, distributed propulsion, things like that we need to make sure that our compliance kind of standards are in line with the way the designs are being put together. So we're gonna figure that out. We're gonna come up with some methods of compliance and make recommendations to the airworthiness process on how we can use those in any of the gaps that we have in place. And then finally, we intend to walk out the backside of this with some recommendations and advice to the TAA that we mentioned earlier, Mr. Fisher, on how he can set things up within his office to make sure that he has what he needs to get those things certified. So I'm going to leave this chart up here because I love the notes that they took from when I presented this at the launch. But I'd like to, at this point, we can open it up for questions. We can start looking at answering some of the questions that are out there, Sterling, if you've got any.
Yeah, a couple of comments. Thanks a lot, Frank, for the presentation there. Real quick, Frank, you hearing me okay?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Sorry, we'll have a little bit more time for better comm checks. But thanks for everyone who joined us today. A couple of just overarching comments. Again, the philosophy here is that we are doing everything that we can to minimize the duplication of activity that would have to be done by the manufacturers that are out there. And so what are the things that can be done in conjunction? Again, we're not creating military requirements for these vehicles. That's not our intent. The technology is very new. We have been, over the course of several months, been working closely in coordination kind of at a high level with some of the folks at the headquarters FAA, and we've started now recently getting into some more detailed discussion. And so we have some folks on here with us from the FAA. We've got Peter White, Wes Ryan, Dave Sizu, and Brian Klinka from the FAA, who've been the fantastic team working with the OEMs for several years now, actually, and have helped us understand a little bit of the maturity of the vehicles out there. And to a large degree, we have based a lot of the timing on the overarching Agility Prime strategy based on the work that the FAA is doing. We also have been working with NASA as well, as everyone's familiar with the national campaign now and some of the pieces that they are doing on their airworthiness side. So we intend to stay in close coordination with them. But again, the overarching philosophy here is, are there ways that in the very near term we can open up resources? And while this particular conversation is focused on airworthiness, we're certainly happy to go back and cover some of the discussions on contracting that we did last week, so that there's a clear understanding of what we mean by these areas of interest, who's eligible for those areas of interest, if there's any clarity that's needed on that, or some of the contracting activity. But again, that contracting activity, ideally, that's putting us in a place where we can then, at the very early stages, right, we see this as a learning campaign. And so those AOIs provide the initial learning for us to understand, is this a company that's in a position, is the technology in a position to relatively quickly start going through a test campaign? And through that test campaign, our intent is to learn about that technology and start to understand, do we make this progressive investment with taxpayer dollars in a way that will yield some return on that investment for a variety of different use cases that you saw outlined when we did the launch event. So as we're doing that, part of that discussion is, and again, just to reiterate on these contracting vehicles, we are focused on a higher level of maturity of vehicles that will be going into flight tests. So a TRL 6 and up. Below that, we do have a lot of other resources and partners that are working to help accelerate different parts of this industry. So there's clearly a lot of work that's been done with DARPA in the past. In particular, the Army Research Laboratory has some activities that they are going to work with us on in the relatively near term. Obviously, the Air Force Research Laboratory, the other services labs as well, work on some of those lower TRL capabilities and provide, in some cases, the bridge funding if there's a military specific item. But again, our intent is primarily to focus on that commercial item, so that with the phase 1, we can get a baseline level of understanding. As we go into the phase 2 AOI discussions, looking specifically at those company engagements with what we have this year. Again, this is for us just a pacing mechanism for us with the contracting funding that we have and with the personnel that we have for managing these AOIs, to in this year looking for something that is actually going to be flying prior to December 17th of this year. Will we extend that? Highly likely that we could extend that. And as you know, right now, that ICO, that is the contracting foundation, is something that is written out into 2025. So we anticipate, right, this is not a source selection. We anticipate going at the pace of industry. So it could be, you're in a position you think you might fly this year. So you apply to the AOI phase 1, and we would then look at AOI phase 2, and maybe there's different places, great that we have familiarity with your technology at a baseline level, but you may wait in phase 2 for a while until there's a little bit more ability to show the level of maturity, so that we can eventually move into testing there. And then with phase 3, as Frank said, our intent at that point is really to start to work with some flavor of contractual relationship or some agreement that would allow that near-term use of government resources, of test expertise, a path that starts to allow us to spend a decent amount of our government resources towards your particular airworthiness, And if we get to that airworthiness, then it puts us in a position to then, or if we see that you're on a path to get to that airworthiness, it gives us an opportunity then, as we said, we talked about the technical risk, the airworthiness helping with a regulatory risk by ideally generating data in a restricted environment to eventually get to those early use cases. And as I said at the beginning, we've largely used industry's desire and general intent that there could be some early operations commercially in 2023, along with the FAA's engagement with several of the manufacturers out there, suggesting that by 2023, those flights could happen. Going into that phase 3 then, and allowing us to, the phase 3 awards that could happen could be as simple as the ability just to fly in DoD airspace. That ICO also gives latitude, though, to award, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars of contracting for procurement of either services or of hardware. And as Frank said, this airworthiness piece for us in DoD, until we're in a place where we can start to leverage, in a more wholesale, the commercial certification with all the hard work that the FAA is doing, this airworthiness is our path to get to those revenue generating use cases. I want to follow up one more item and then give any of the folks from the FAA, if they have any particular discussion points that they want to make, and then we'll switch over to questions. And again, welcome questions both specific to airworthiness as well as any associated with the AOIs. The other point that's been asked several times, and just want to reiterate, is this idea of autonomy. And as Frank will tell you, and I'll maybe hand it back over to him just for a moment to get AFRL's position on this. Dr. Roper, our senior acquisition executive, is very intent on trying to find paths to leverage taxpayer investment in DoD autonomy in as quickly as we can to help some of the commercial autonomy. And Frank and his team at the Air Force Research Laboratory have a series of projects that have been kind of pushing at the edges of those, as he will tell you. Right, autonomy has a lot of different levels, and there's all kinds of things that we do today that some people might call autonomy. Clearly, as you move forward into a future where, right, you may be generating through some autonomy, new flight control laws over the course of a flight, or where you're doing more sophisticated sense and avoid, where you have some flavor of algorithms that are making decisions en route. Obviously, those places where we would expect completely unpiloted operations and fully autonomous operations, we see being a little bit further out. But as you know, there are some of the companies in this space that are pursuing that aggressively. We would love to create an opportunity for early testing of that, understanding how we test autonomy, understanding how to build trust. Right, some good points made. That there's a trust between humans trusting the machine. In some cases, there's the machine trusting the human, and then there's those cases of the machine trusting the machine. And what is necessary to get the correct type of data, what is necessary to ensure that those algorithms are operating within the proper constraints. Those are all efforts that we hope to pursue relatively aggressively, and maybe even with some additional funding in some cases. Or leveraging some of the other DoD autonomy efforts that are out there. But that certainly is a high level of interest. We see that as essential long-term, as does, I think, most of the folks in this industry. That ability to get to autonomy is essential just because it provides such huge opportunities for operations cost savings by being able to either remove the pilot from the cockpit or get to where you're having a single pilot providing oversight to a variety of different vehicles. Those are things that are interesting to the Air Force. They're interesting to the Marine Corps, who has partnered with us on Agility Prime, and across the DoD, a good amount of investment, but challenges in that. So I'd like to take maybe a second just for Frank, if you have any follow-on comments for autonomy. We'll see if there's any of the folks in the FAA that have some high-level comments that they would like to provide to the rest of the group here, and then we'll switch over to questions again specific to airworthiness or some of the broader questions associated with other parts of Agility Prime. So Frank, back over to you of additional thoughts on the autonomy piece in particular, based on some of the questions, broader questions that we've had.
Sure. Thanks, Nate. Yeah, the autonomy is a tricky subject. A lot of times you spend the great majority of your time discussing how you even define autonomy. So that can be a hard part about even talking about it. But you know, for us in the lab, we've been working towards looking at different types of autonomous systems, whether we talk machine learning or neural networks or AI, however you define that, or you even have rules-based autonomy. So it really depends on what you're trying to do. It also, when it comes to certification of a platform with autonomy on board, depends on where that autonomy lives. If we're talking about, you know, some kind of complex function living in a mission system that doesn't have the ability to control the aircraft or direct the aircraft to do anything, then it's a little easier to get there from here than if we're talking about some kind of complex algorithm that can't be tested using traditional software testing and certification techniques living in your flight control system. So, you know, those are different levels of scrutiny and different levels of proof of operations. One of the things we've looked at in the lab, and it's out there, and you see it in industry as well, is considering alternative ways to certify a complex function within a system, whether that be some kind of runtime assurance where you build a sandbox for this complex function and you certify that sandbox using traditional methods, and then whatever's living inside that sandbox is certified to a lower standard because it may do things that you can't completely predict, whether it's quote unquote non-deterministic or not. We've started to see some work in formal methods, and if you're familiar with formal methods, it's kind of baseline proofs, kind of similar to Pythagorean theorem. Instead of going out and measuring every right triangle sides, I've got a Pythagorean theorem that can tell me what those sides will be if I know two of them. Well, there are developments within software where we have similar kinds of formal methods of software that allow us to do a similar kind of prediction where we know that things cannot go in ways that we don't necessarily want it to. That's early on, though. I would argue that your best bet for getting autonomy certified within you know, a safety critical or flight critical system at this point is probably looking at a runtime architecture, which comes with its own set of challenges as well. So while I wouldn't say that we've solved the problem for certification of autonomous systems yet, and that's still something that is in the process, it's definitely something we've been working on for a while here in the lab, both the performance side of things and also thinking about how to get there with certification.
Super, thanks for that, Frank. Are there any folks still on from FAA with any high-level comments? I'll give a pause for a moment there, and then if not, then we'll start to move over for some of the questions to the audience out there. And largely, as we advertise to the FAA, asking that they come on just to tell us, keep us honest here and make sure that the things we're saying are accurate, and we've got a path to continue to kind of work forward with them. So if there's any thoughts for the folks that want to come up there, otherwise we'll start going through the questions.
Yeah, this is Peter White. I can chat real briefly. I work at the FAA in the Policy and Innovation Division and run a small branch that we call the Center for Emerging Concepts and Innovation. And we are, you know, our goal is to actively engage with companies that bring forward innovative projects, which are projects for which we've got big regulatory gaps. So we have regulations in place for turbine engines and reciprocating engines, but we really don't have regs developed yet and published for electric propulsion batteries and, you know, a lot of the technologies that are in these vehicles. So my office is set up to engage early with applicants with innovative technologies to determine just how we're going to do that certification and how we'll, have a safe introduction of these complex technologies into the NAS. And we're looking, I think, similar to you at a, crawl, walk, run type approach. Start out with a low risk approach and then work, towards a more, higher risk approach as we get experience with the technologies. So yeah, we, with artificial intelligence and some of the, autonomous technologies, we don't have plans in place at this time for how, we're not set up to approve such systems now. We're working actively on developing those methodologies through R&D projects and other things. Runtime assurance is an area that we're looking at as well. But in the short term, our plan is to certify, the basic vehicles as, for Part 91 simplified type operations, to get that piece done. And then as we develop the capabilities, certify the more complex, detect and avoid and other systems, potentially at a later date. So crawl would be, certify as a, Part 91 vehicle without the complex technology certified. And then as we get the, capabilities, figure out how to approve the more complex operations. So, for artificial intelligence and things like that, we're still developing those methodologies. But we are finding that we are able to take our existing airworthiness requirements and tailor them to these vehicles. And as we get into the operational approval, we can start to add on some of the, do subsequent certification efforts to approve some of the more complex systems like DAA and autonomy, things like that. So I'm going to defer to some of the other folks that have more experience in the technical areas at this point. But yeah, I appreciate the time to chat today. And we are looking forward to collaborating with the DoD on these projects.
Super. Thanks a lot for that, Peter. Appreciate, and it's been really great to hear too from the OEMs who've been working with the FAA offices on this. Just great feedback of really how the FAA is really teaming with, as Peter said, a lot of these technologies that we don't necessarily, still working through some of the details. So it's been encouraging to see that really good feedback there. Are there anyone else from the FAA before we move over to questions?
Hey, this is Brian Klinka. I just want to compliment what Peter said, and we are working with many of the OEMs to develop the requirements because there are large gaps, and it's certainly exciting, and we're looking forward to working with you as well.
Super. All right. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Brian. And, like we said, really trying to take opportunities in the very near term of being in the same room with the FAA as these conversations are happening, hopefully being able to use some collaborative approaches for gaps that we have in knowledge, different resources that different parts of the government have, and trying to minimize that burden while making sure that we're keeping kind of that gold standard for certification, both internal to DoD and with FAA and across other organizations as well. So with that, let's move over to some of the questions.
Yeah, for sure. I think first we've got a couple of questions about, are the slides going to be available to download later? And I think the recorded videos will be available on our website at some point in the future.
Yeah, we will have the recorded videos available, and then we can, there's probably a way as all of you have seen, we've been trying to do some evolution to the webpage, making sure that previous videos from, all the videos from the launch week, you can see at agilityprime.com. All the documents associated with the contracting are there under Air Race, and then connecting via both through the webinars on the homepage there, as well as the Slack channel that's there, looking to create some additional channels for Slack, specifically to kind of create opportunities for a continuous question answer flow there. So those are there, and then we'll look for opportunities specifically for posting slides if that's what folks want, but expecting to have the videos very soon.
Frank, one for you. Does the United States Air Force use an interim flight clearance like NavAir uses?
So I would say that our military flight release is very similar to the interim flight clearances. So it is a temporary flight release, temporary airworthiness approval that is limited in scope, like I talked about. So I think you'll find that those are very similar.
Yeah, I think this is kind of in the same vein, but they're asking, will our experimental certificates issued by the FAA be honored by the Air Force? At what point does military certification become a requirement?
So it depends on what you mean by honored by. We certainly recognize the FAA's authority to issue an experimental ticket and allow aircraft to fly under those. That's, you know, we're not denying that. And if you can fly within the limits of that experimental ticket, you know, so for instance, if we were able to find a range for you to go fly and the range is okay with that experimental ticket, then you could come and fly within the limits of that ticket. In terms of whether the Air Force recognizes that as a design certification, I don't think the FAA even recognizes that as a design certification. And so because of the requirements that we have within the DoD for our airworthiness, you have to have some kind of design evaluation against a set of standards in order to get an airworthiness approval. So in that respect, the experimental ticket can provide some information to help us get to that design evaluation, but in and of itself is not sufficient. And where you generally tend to see the trigger happen for needing to get the Air Force's airworthiness involved is when you start triggering public aircraft operations. So when the Air Force starts taking responsibility for the operations and maintenance oversight rather than the FAA, which means you're operating under Air Force rules at that point, that's when we have to get involved. We have to issue some kind of airworthiness release, and that usually happens when you start flying on the Air Force's dime, right? So when we start contracting a company to come and fly something that we are asking them to fly and we pay for that, then that's gonna generally trigger that requirement.
Perfect, thanks, Frank. Can you comment on the availability of test and eval for certification facilities, especially for rapid use? Yeah, he just mentions that they can be booked for many years in advance.
Yeah. A typical test program to get into some of these unique facilities, like the Climate Lab at Eglin, or maybe the Benefield Anechoic facility out at AFWERX. Yeah, you got to get in there a year and a half in advance, right? Well, if there is a silver lining to COVID-19, is that it's blown up everybody's flight test schedules, and so what that does is it blows up the schedules for all these facilities as well. So what we're finding is a lot of these facilities that would normally be booked well in advance are starting to see some white space open up that we might be able to take advantage in the short term. So obviously, as a program, we don't go out. We're not the 500-pound gorilla. We can't just walk in the door and say we're gonna take this facility and use it for our purposes now. We're very much on a kind of a as available basis. But assuming that we get something set up with the contractors and we can move quickly, I think we can take advantage of some of the chaos that's out there in the schedule right now, and we can start to get people into some of these facilities as needed. You know, if you've spent any amount of time in the test world, you know that the schedule is constantly moving around anyway. And so even under normal operations, you will see last minute spots open up in ranges and facilities. So our intent was always to try and take advantage of that by being as quick and agile as we could to jump in on those opportunities.
Yeah, so I'm going to put a couple of questions together here, but essentially they're talking about certification of maybe upstream components like the propulsion system, or maybe as a manufacturer certification, and whether they can work with us to achieve data for those?
So the Air Force's approach to airworthiness, and this is another difference maybe between the FAA and the Air Force and the DoD, we do not certify subsystems or individual components for airworthiness. So except for engines, which are the exception that proves the rule, we won't certify a subsystem. What we do is we certify the entire aircraft system in its entirety and its ability to attain, sustain, and complete flight. So if you've got a subsystem that you'd like to get certified, what we need to do is we need to see that within the context of an architecture and a design of the whole vehicle to get it through our airworthiness process.
This one is a little bit different. Can you talk about the United States Air Force's approach to new approaches to airworthiness, like model-based engineering, and how we envision integrating it with 516C?
Yeah, so there's a whole within the LCMC engineering office there's a big push right now to start looking or to start driving towards digital engineering solutions, including model-based systems engineering, digital threads, digital twins, if we can get to that. So they are actively pursuing that. I know they've got high-level support on that front. Whether I can't speak right now to how it's specifically tied into their ability to use 516C, but I can tell you that when a program comes forward, when you're going for full certification and you work through, okay, here are the criteria that apply to us, when you're building that tailored airworthiness certification criteria, you also get an agreement with what type or methods of compliance that you're going to use to show for that criteria. And if you've got a model-based systems engineering approach and you want to use that model as your method of compliance, then that is something that you talk with the airworthiness team about, and then they can set up what they need to see to make that a valid way of doing it. So I would tell you that while I don't think there is at least I'm not aware of a set procedure on how to do that, I think it can be tailored in if you have something that can be proven to be adequate.
Sure, and maybe a question better for Nate, but you can weigh in on this as well, Frank. What cost should a company expect to cover in best case support scenario? Can you just kind of speak on cost splitting and what in kind actually means?
So I think I'll guess that Frank's answer is that it depends. If I were betting, right? I mean, it could be across the spectrum. Certainly, we are limited just on our current budget as we try to. We described a bit in the launch week how we've kind of selected this portfolio of AOIs 1, 2, and 3. That one, there's a significant amount of resourcing that has gone into AOI 1. Right, this is your 3 to 6, maybe 8 passenger vehicle, and that has been a significant focus for the urban air mobility market. The AOI 2, where you have 1 to 2 passengers, has been an area where some of the companies have leveraged Part 103, and in other cases, right, if you believe that you can buy an airplane by the pound, they're smaller, lighter aircraft, and so potentially opportunity, one, to get some maturity or more flying experience based on some of the companies that have been operating under Part 103, as well as maybe an opportunity to fly some of the smaller aircrafts at a lower cost sooner. And there's maybe some missions where we would be interested in that, just for for base monitoring, for example. That might be interesting, or you could even imagine cases where we have a first responder as a single passenger or 2 passenger vehicle, that could be interesting. And then the third being the unmanned cargo and the larger unmanned cargo, where in some cases they're maybe pushing the autonomy a little bit further, as well as the range a little bit further, looking in some of those cases more for hybrid vehicles. Across that spectrum, as we try to bring forward that portfolio of areas that are interesting to us, right? The AOIs, the areas of interest. We're balancing just the resourcing that we have There's been several questions reading across the chat of are we going to fund prototypes? The answer is we're not. When DoD funds prototypes, right, they do that through some of the DARPA projects, or they do a request for proposal, and we dictate then the requirements for those prototypes. We're not dictating the requirements for prototypes, and so we are not funding prototypes and that research and development. What we are funding is if you have a compelling commercial use case, then we would fund some of the testing, so that in-kind testing. That in-kind testing could be things like, as I think Frank alluded to, we can give you some priority if you're on a government contract to get into a wind tunnel, for example. Cases where we might be able to accelerate entry into a wind tunnel, maybe by 6 months or a year, potentially. Us potentially being able to provide the cost and pay for that, so that, or some parts of that, so that it's a reduced cost that you're getting to use that government asset. So it could vary wildly. It will depend, again, on the maturity. If we've clicked along and we found a variety of the different areas where we find, high level of maturity, and there's a couple of areas where maybe the company doesn't need so much for commercial certification, but we're interested in for military certification. Those may be areas where we're willing to invest a little bit more because we see a high level of military utility, and so a little bit of additional cost for us to get that learning is where we would put more funding in. So I hope that answers a question that, it depends radically on some of those things. There's a little bit of discussion too about other areas of interest from other questions that I'm seeing on chat. We have those 3 particular areas of interest. We introduced briefly at the end of our last day of the launch event a desire certainly to work with partner countries and do that in a way that maybe gives them an opportunity to see some of the vehicles that we have, and may find areas where they would like to collaborate on those vehicles, as well as us getting potentially an opportunity. Our Office of Secretary of Defense, there's specifically an office that does collaborative prototyping or collaborative testing work. And so potential for Agility Prime to collaborate with some of those partner nations and their industrial base, their manufacturers, to see if there would be value of bringing that capability into Agility Prime. The other areas of interest that we have considered, and we certainly, again, the request for information is still out there. If you have thoughts in this, we certainly would welcome thoughts, but an area of interest that could be focused more on autonomy could be something that we would look at into the future. An area of interest that could focus on potentially range extension and alternative approaches to propulsion, or an area of interest focused more on those foreign partner nation manufacturing capability. Again, we keep that RFI open specifically to solicit your ideas and see how we might do that. Another one, could be on digital engineering and potential processes for digital engineering and ways that digital engineering might accelerate development from a design perspective, from a development perspective, from a manufacturing perspective, and then, ideally long-term operations, being able to reduce costs there. So hopefully got a little bit of a sense of how we were making some decisions on our investment and what that might look like. So with that, we'll go back to a few other questions, unless Frank has some follow-on points on the support and how much support for the testing.
No, I think you covered it, Nate. You're right. It depends, and it's a discussion that we can have in that phase 2 of the AOI, really based on what your needs are and what we can provide.
Sure. A little bit more specific question here. If our local CAA has a bilateral agreement with the FAA, can that certification be done via our CAA?
I'd have to hand that one off to the FAA guys.
Yeah, sorry. If we don't have an answer for that, we'll dig into that and try to get that out on the next sessions. But unless one of the FAA folks are there and is well educated on the international agreements between civil authorities, we might have to pass on that one for now.
Yeah, this is Wes. I'll just make a quick comment that, you know, the bilateral agreements are very specific on the things that they cover, depending on our level of familiarity and how much we've worked with a particular authority. So for an entire airframe, we often do, you know, recognize certifications from other authorities. However, some of the new and novel nature of these types of aircraft will certainly cause any certification to most likely be done in some type of either concurrent manner or with lots of discussion at the technical level on the acceptable requirements for, you know, any new and novel features. So it's likely it will take a high level of coordination for any certification that comes from another entity.
Perfect. Thank you, Ryan. A little bit from Peter Shannon. Where do you see the differences in airworthiness data collection, flight test, and company engagement timeline that you described here with what is being done with NASA's national campaign? Will differing aspects be prioritized in the two programs? Scenarios, data collection exercises? It would be interesting to think about the ways that differences can be constructed towards overall strategic goals. So maybe just a little bit on our interaction with the national campaign that NASA is ongoing with.
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to that. We are certainly plugged in with those guys, and we're having discussions with them. You know, we have different approaches. So they've got their scenarios, and they've got their kind of set up for how they're trying to define what kind of capabilities that players should bring to the table. That's very different from what we're doing. And they're doing it. It's a great thing that they're doing because they're trying to push the envelope of what can be done and demonstrate capabilities to really help the FAA and everyone else develop the standards that are needed to make these things operational, both for not just the aircraft, but the entire structure and the entire architecture behind everything that needs to happen. So in many ways, it's a completely different scope from what we're doing. We, as a program, are here to help the aircraft manufacturers get to their civil certs, and in the end, help to create that industrial base that we can then access later on. So there are certainly overlaps between our programs, and that's why we're coordinating with NASA, and that's why we're keeping an eye on what they're doing, and hopefully they're watching what we're doing. But we don't intend to merge the programs or anything like that, where because we have different goals in mind. I don't know, Nate, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think you know, again, there's opportunity there for some of the flight tests where we can do some collaboration, I think, across the board with some of the OEMs that are out there. And we are in the early stages of looking specifically what those test campaigns look like, so that is achieving some of the ends. I would say, yeah, again, we're focused more on the vehicles in the near term, whereas NASA, I think, has done a fantastic job of looking at the broader ecosystem for the civil piece. So I guess I would make that probably as the high level distinction, and we're continuing to, you know, to find areas where we can do the right collaboration with them, and not duplicate things and be able to leverage different resources. But at the high level, that civil and the larger, I think systems, while we're focused in the near term on the specific vehicles.
Yeah, and Frank, I think we've touched on these two a little bit, but do suppliers of electric powertrains need to work with airframers to participate in the program, or can we work directly with Agility Prime? And then another question, is there any support available for manufacturing certification?
So on the propulsion subsystem, I would say that your best bet for working on Agility Prime is to find an integrator to work with there, because we are not, you know, we have to limit the scope of what the program can do, and we can't open it up to every subsystem developer out there. And really, you don't want us to, because we are not the experts on what's really needed within the market space. The integrators and the guys building the aircraft are. So I would encourage you to engage with the manufacturers on that front. As far as manufacturer certification, we don't necessarily do that here within Agility Prime. Honestly, I'd have to point you in the direction of some of our more logistically minded folks to find a real answer to that question.
For sure. Can we use PMI methodology, or is there a US Air Force project management methodology? Do we require PM certification?
So we don't, the Air Force tends to work under the Defense Acquisition kind of APDP, which is the kind of the acquisition professional system. It's very similar to PMI, but it's kind of focused on the 5000 series and the traditional acquisition of systems for the DoD and the Air Force. It all depends on what your contract says, but maybe somebody else can speak to this, but I've never seen an Air Force contract that requires PMI certification. That's usually something within the company itself.
Yeah, I would agree, Frank.
Our company builds a system for MIL applications, and we are considering use of a subsystem from non-US supplier. Is there a requirement for MIL applications that software be developed in the US? Maybe just speak on a little bit of the supply chain elements from overseas suppliers.
Yeah, certainly. So, there's not a, depending on the type of systems, right now, again, we're looking at commercial systems. So there's not any, hardcore restrictions on what is where, but obviously as we dig into the assessment of that supply chain, obviously security of the supply chain is going to be a priority. And that is an area you heard during the launch week, some discussions that NASA is doing on supply chain security. Certainly it is an area where we in DoD spend a good amount of time. So that's going to be, we will, as we dig into kind of each of the different companies, certainly the ones that are creating the vertically integrated companies are going to have likely an easier time with that. That said, we certainly are supportive of ways that help build that resilient and secure supply chain, and are looking at opportunities of doing that as well.
Sure, Frank. I think this is a follow-on from our earlier question on overseas certification. Does the DoD recognize civilian type certs from foreign countries, e.g. EASA or New Zealand CAA? More specifically, I guess, focused on DoD recognition.
So I don't have the current list, but there are agreements between foreign airworthiness authorities and the Air Force in place. Each one of those I think is unique, and I don't know what kind of reciprocity exists between them. But I would say your best bet is to engage with the Air Force Airworthiness Office and find out, or engage with your foreign airworthiness office and find out what kind of reciprocity agreement they have in place.
So Frank, this is Brian. I can answer that more directly.
Oh, Brian, great.
Yep. So
you can definitely answer for tonight.
Yeah, we do not have any agreements today where we can accept the certification of foreign CAAs or foreign military airworthiness authorities. We can indirectly do that with some of the foreign civil authorities using the bilateral agreement through the FAA. So if you're able to achieve that with the FAA, we do accept FAA approvals, and that's one mechanization. But as we discussed earlier, some of these new and novel technologies, the FAA will only certify through the bilateral for which they have rules to certify. So a lot of that coordination has to happen at a higher level before it can go to the FAA. But once it does make it to the FAA, and once it is certified by the FAA, we can then recognize the FAA certification.
Perfect. Thank you, Brian. Nate, maybe a little bit here. The question is is the Air Force interested in assistance with this program for ship-based aircraft or only land-based? Maybe you can speak on the USMC interest or NavAir interest.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's a thought, clearly some additional challenges being able to operate ship-based. There has been some interest expressed by the Marine Corps as well as the Navy in doing ship-to-ship or ship-to-shore operations. You can certainly look back and see a long history of interest of recent projects done by DARPA for different vehicles, maybe of this type, and then across the Navy. For the Air Force, not necessarily a near-term priority, but as we start to do some of the work with the Marine Corps, that has been an area where they have certainly shown some interest, and potential as they move forward, doing, as I said, with them having partnered with us on some of the early testing that they would like to do with some of the manufacturers. That may be an area where depending on, if there's, you could imagine some commercial use cases, at least operating in that environment, maybe cases of being able to, in the petroleum industry for offshore oil rigs, that environment could be a place that would have a commercial interest as well. And so one could imagine a need to do testing in there for DoD, but currently not something that we've looked into in much detail ourselves.
Yeah, for sure. I think our last question is queued up now. So if anyone else has questions, please do put them in the Q&A feature. Will the government require data rights equity for exchange of a flight demo contract and or support? Frank, Nate, just a little bit on data rights.
I mean, I'll talk to that at a high level of our intent with data rights, and I'll let Frank talk to maybe some of the details that he needs as he starts to dig into airworthiness. But by and large, again, the intent on this is these are commercial use vehicles. Many of the companies that are operating under an SBIR, there are some fantastic data right opportunities under those SBIRs. So we don't really necessarily, we're not looking to purchase the data rights. We, again, are not paying for research and development. So in other programs in DoD where the government has paid for the development of that intellectual property, then certainly there's cases where we want to maintain that investment so that there can be reuse and save dollars for the taxpayer. In this case, given the fact that most of the intellectual property is being developed through commercial dollars with investors, there's not a huge need. Well, there's just not a case really where we are going to somehow try to get data rights out of that. We do think that there's probably cases from a standards perspective where starting to create some common interfaces and understand what those common interfaces look like. There's certainly value in that. We think in the long term, being able to, and value for the industry at large, not just for the DoD. So there's cases there where there's opportunity probably to discuss what type of data is passed, right? So this is more interfaces, understanding interfaces, and not maybe having proprietary interfaces across the board. But none of those things are going to be, something that we would negotiate to us owning data rights if we're providing, in-kind testing, for example. So not expecting that to be much of a challenge in negotiations or discussions moving forward. Frank, you may want to talk just a little bit more detail, the types, the level of detail that you're expecting as you're going through the airworthiness process, what some of those artifacts look like in a little bit more detail, and then the associated data rights and the approaches that we're taking to ensure that all of your the company's proprietary data is protected in that process.
Yeah, so the contracting process really kind of dictates where the data rights fall, and so that will depend on the contract that you have. There are some inherent data rights that come from, like Nate mentioned, doing research and development with the government, and those are spelled out within the contract. So I would say if you have concerns about that, you definitely want to bring that up in the discussion that leads up to whatever kind of agreement you have in place. But from an airworthiness perspective, we are going to, just by the nature of what we're trying to do, we're going to have to look a little more closely at some of the designs and maybe some of the proprietary work that's gone into that design. But the purpose isn't for us to then take that and own it and license it or sell it or anything like that. What we're trying to do is find a way to show that design shows some compliance with, or doesn't show compliance with some specification or criteria that we have in place. So what you'll typically see from our airworthiness guys when they come in, they'll start asking questions about, so for instance, if we talk structures, because that's what I know, I'm a structures guy. You might have a finite element model of your aircraft, and you might have some unique designs, with your materials manufacturing or with your composite aircraft design or something like that, and your models all show that you have 10 times the margin that you would really need, and that it's the best thing since sliced bread. But then our guys, might go, well, that all sounds really good. Now, what kind of analysis or what kind of tests or what kind of demonstrations do you have to show that all of your models that you've shown me are actually true and accurate? And that's the kind of thing that we need to then say that model is an accurate representation of reality. So, they're going to come in and they're going to just kind of ask higher level questions to understand your approach and to understand your design, and then to just make sure that is an accurate representation of how the system actually is going to exist. Because then, it ultimately, we want something that's not going to have a fracture happen in flight and cause some kind of catastrophic failure. So that's kind of the motivation behind some of the maybe proprietary things that we need to look at. Now, on a program like this, we have very specific bins and walls set up so that your proprietary data is not going to leak out and go to another contractor. Like I said, our guys are there looking at it from an airworthiness ability to attain, sustain, and complete flight perspective. We're not looking to share your proprietary designs with anyone else.
Yeah, and since we have Brian here, I don't know if Brian, you or if there's anyone else from the Airworthiness Office that has any additional comments on that in terms of detail that you're looking for, and things that you've seen kind of from success and those that have had more challenges. If there's any additions that you want to add to that.
Sorry, I had to figure out the mute button there. I didn't hear. Sorry, I didn't hear Frank's whole answer there. But no, I don't think I have any additions beyond that this time.
Okay. Shirley, back to you for some of the other questions that are out there.
Yeah, I think we have one last one here, and then if you want to have any closing statements from the team. How early in the design, development, testing process is the DoD looking to get involved?
So I would say, what we're trying to do is at least kind of establish a little bit of the expectation in these discussions here. Given there's, I don't know, I think Mike Hirschberg said there's now some 270 companies that are out there. We certainly don't necessarily have the bandwidth to engage with all of those companies that are out there. And so, we would love to kind of follow along with the companies that are approaching a level of maturity. But what we are hoping to do really just in this discussion is start to provide at least a little bit more of an understanding of what that process looks like in the early phases, so that it's not something, that's an afterthought, that from the outset of the program is being designed with certification in mind as you're developing your engineering artifacts. That's being done with certification in mind as you're doing some of your early testing, that all of those things are pointing towards something that is going to get you to certification. So in terms of near term, I think until those artifacts are really starting to come together, until you are approaching a place where you're ready to start doing flight tests, we don't necessarily foresee ourselves to some degree having the bandwidth or really providing that much value to your airworthiness process, as long as that's something that you've kept in mind, and hopefully we can start to with a collective group here, and again in conjunction with some of the other government agencies that are out there, we can start to help inform that and help you go more deliberately and get to what that certification looks like long term. Aside from that, until you're ready, I think, to approach a level of maturity outlined by these areas of interest, probably not too valuable to you to jump right into that process. And then Frank, if you have any follow-ons to that.
I would agree with that. I think in many ways our AOIs kind of point to where we want to get involved in the process. So, we want you to have kind of a full-scale flying prototype and get to that level of design maturity so that we can understand your design at that point. That's not to say that we're not interested in those earlier design stages, but that's kind of where our focus is right now. And we may push earlier than that on future AOIs, but that's where we're at right now.
Thanks. Yeah, there's another question just talking about what the FAA and DoD relationship, NASA relationship looks like. Like we said, we've to some degree we have other agreements that are in place for existing programs that are there, but this is starting the early discussions is where we are right now, and looking again with, I think, the overarching emphasis on how we can collectively bring different resources in, what that looks like into the future, and how much we need to formalize that are still kind of internal discussions there. Any other items that are out there? Sterling?
I think that's all the questions we have on our side if you want to wrap up.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'll give it back over kind of Frank specifically on the airworthiness. And Frank, I don't know if you have any of the other folks on your airworthiness team that have any comments you want to give specifically on airworthiness, and then we'll talk to some of the broader Agility Prime issues kind of in closing here.
Yeah, I'll just finish it up with saying that a lot of times the flavor I get when talking to some of these operators, especially ones that haven't engaged with DoD airworthiness before, is there's a certain level of anxiety about engaging with the process. And I understand that it's not, it is not an easy process. It really is kind of somebody double checking all your work from an engineering perspective, right? So that can bring up some fear and anxiety. I equate it to kind of a peer review look at what you've done. So there is some anxiety there, but I can tell you this, that we are here to help you get through that. And as I hope you've kind of gotten from the flavor of the briefings that I've presented, that there are different levels as well. So just because you may hear the horror stories about, some program that took 10 years to get through the airworthiness process, well, that was probably a program that was a full weapon system with a full set of requirements and specifications against standards that were well established, and then they had to build their tailored airworthiness certification criteria, and they had to develop all their methods of compliance against those criteria, and get to the full military type certification. That's not necessarily what we're talking about in this program. Maybe it is in the long run, maybe that's something down the road, but in the initial stages, like I mentioned, our first step here is to help you get to your FAA civil cert. That's where your focus needs to be, and that's what we completely understand, and we don't want to derail that. If anything, we want to help speed that along. And we can, at the same time, find parallel ways to get there on the military side of things, depending on the scope of what we're trying to do. So don't be anxious, don't be scared. We're here to help you with that. And the more work we can put into it now without getting in the way of what you're doing, leveraging some of the work you're already doing, the easier it's going to be down the road, if and when we get to that point where we have a dual use capability that we want to start running through a full airworthiness type of certification. So thanks everyone for listening today. I hope we answered a good number of your questions, and I'll leave it off to you, Nate, to finish it out, please.
Yeah, thanks for the time. Thanks for the other folks that were here, willing to kind of help us with some of the questions that are out there. We'll start looking in more detail next week. A couple of the things that we are looking at and would welcome thoughts from the folks that are out there. Different ways. There's one question about supply chain, and certainly since the Agility Prime launch, we've been receiving a significant number of questions and requests to bring different technologies forward. As Frank said, we're not necessarily, as we look at some of the subsystems, probably not in a great position where we're going to go start looking at individual subsystems, but we're certainly interested in understanding a little bit more clearly where there might be gaps in the supply chain, and where potentially there's opportunities to bring some multiple different manufacturers together. Fortunately, we had someone, Mike Kirchberg, had said there's now 275 aircraft in design out there, over 200 developers. So that's there's still a significant amount of energy with a lot of different partners that are out there. And if there are ideas on ways that we can start to, one, through the RFIs, look at some other areas of interest that might be able to accelerate the different parts of this. We talked a little bit about the autonomy. We talked a little bit about looking at different propulsion approaches, and we talked a little bit about some of the digital engineering. Aside from that, looking at that supply chain and where there might be gaps in that supply chain, and finding collaborative ways to accelerate that, not only just from a capabilities, but long-term to how do you start to scale some of the capabilities that are out there in order to meet some of the broader goals for manufacturing at scale. So some of the things that we are looking to do there. And then we'll be talking next week more specifically to testing. Some of the opportunities that we have under testing, obviously, at the launch event, we had several different folks talking to how we are approaching that. For us, realize it's a very different approach to testing. Again, since there are not specific requirements laid out from the DoD, looking to do testing in a way that helps us to open up some of the use cases and find places where we have a gap right now that these vehicles might be able to fill. So that's a little bit different for us. The developmental testing, obviously, helping to fill any gaps that there are in data for the particular airworthiness process. And then more largely, as we start to move into operations, we have an approach where we're taking some of the analytics and looking at how we might take different attributes of the vehicles, and as part of a larger portfolio of systems, how a particular vehicle potentially feeds into multiple different mission sets. So looking at a way of aggregating, certainly there's obvious things like range and payload and speed, but for us also looking at different approaches to expense, how we might look at different ways of leveraging approaches that some developers have taken that maybe there's more expense up front, but long term, the operational expense is reduced. And so trying to find ways in our early testing to begin understanding what that operational expense looks like, starting to understand with our batteries, for example, what do turn times between vehicles look like when you have batteries that might have to cool down for some bit before they start charging. and between charge to next reuse. What does that look like? What might that look like in some of the hybrid systems, and ways that we do some of that testing in the early stages that help us characterize how many of the vehicles will be able to operate, at what frequency we'll be able to operate them, and then at what cost. So next week, as we go through those test discussions, starting to outline some of that, and then more specifically outlining some of the resources that will potentially be useful to the companies as they're moving forward in being able to leverage DoD test resources and some of the DoD test expertise with a variety of government ranges that are around. There's also been a variety of different organizations across the country, some participating in the IPP for the small UAS, where there's ranges that are there that might be able to be used as well, and helping to find some points of collaboration with that. So thanks for the time today. Again, please feel free if there are thoughts on other topics that we have in the future. I'll look forward to getting those through the Slack channel that's there, and through the questions that we're getting here. And then we expect to have these videos posted on the webpage in the near term. So with that, thanks for your time, and we'll be signing off now.